In my opinion, the biggest feature set difference between AMD and NVIDIA isn't ray tracing, it's upscaling. We're hoping that FSR 4 solves that gap, and it is taking a massive step forward. Here, let me disappear and just kind of do a voiceover here. Look how much better FSR 4 is versus FSR 3.1. Yes, we're zooming in and slowing things down so you can see it if you're on a mobile device, etc. But look at how unstable the hair upscaling is on the left-hand side of the screen here. We see a lot of shimmering, shaking, unstableness, and on the right, we're seeing much better reconstruction of detail with FSR 4. These are both rendering internally at 1080p resolution to output a 4K-like image. This is a 4K performance mode, and we're not testing frame generation in this video. So I would say this is going from what to me looks nothing like native TAA to something that looks fairly close, which is what we're testing now. Now on the left-hand side of the screen, we see a native 4K TAA rendering versus the FSR 4 image. And while, sure, I do think I still see a little more artifacting in the FSR 4-based image compared to the native image, it is pretty dang close. Remember, this is 3 times zoomed in and at 50% speed. So I would say that we are now also in certain elements on the hair, maybe even getting a little more detail rendered than the native image, although there is some artifacting as well. So overall, I would say that this is now very close to the native image and much, much more usable, which is awesome. We still do need to look at the performance, which we'll do towards the end of the video, but there's some other comparisons we do need to make here after we finish up our look at native TAA versus FSR 4. And because the question is also, so how close to DLSS is this? Well, this game has a native DLSS implementation of one of the newer versions of DLSS 3, so 3.7.1. And so here we're looking at that on the left and FSR 4 on the right. I would say that there's maybe, if you just look near the neck here, there's a little more flickering on FSR 4. But in general, I would say that the images are of a similar level of detail and similar, actually, issues in the reconstruction. I would say maybe a little more ghostiness on the FSR 4 trailing on the hairs and things like that, with DLSS maybe showing a little less stability. So there are some differences in the image, but I don't think I would say that one of them looks wildly better or worse than the other. In other words, FSR 4, in an image quality standpoint for 4K performance mode, seems to have mostly closed the gap with DLSS 3. What about looking at actual gameplay? So this is back to FSR 3 versus FSR 4. Look how ghosty trailing is and the disocclusion artifacts on the left-hand side of the screen as Spider-Man moves. Look at FSR 4 here on the right. This is a massive improvement. This is, in my opinion, one of the biggest issues with using FSR 3 currently, is just you get way too much ghosting and fizzling on the edges of characters in motion. I also wanted to check things like those tree details in the distance here. If we look at the tree, again, I think there's a lot more breakup and smearing on the left-hand side of the screen. Sorry, but the traffic's not identical every time you load the same save here. But I think the tree looks way more cohesive on the right, although still not perfect. Here's another example of trees in motion, and again, I think that we're seeing a massive improvement, especially as the telephone pole moves across. Look how much ghosting and weirdness happens behind that on the left, and it's not perfect on the right, but it is a massive improvement with FSR 4. So we are seeing huge image quality gains, even if it's not reached complete perfection. I think this is very noticeable. Also, keep in mind if you're watching on a mobile device, you can zoom in and out. You can also increase or decrease the speed of the video. Here's another shot showing Spider-Man in motion, as well as some fencing details in the background. If you look at the fence in the background, notice it's very flickery and unstable on the left with FSR 3, at least when there's not a boat behind it. And it's much more stable in those fine details on the fencing on the right-hand side of the screen with FSR 4. So we are seeing some massive improvements here. But let's look at this same scene again, but now versus native TAA, and then we'll look at it against DLSS 3 and DLSS 4, because again, we need to see how all of these things stack up in these various situations. So now on the left-hand side of the screen, we see native TAA. On the right, we have FSR 4. So I think this is pretty good, because the idea here is you need to, if you're using upscaling to boost performance, ideally you don't see a massive downgrade compared to the native TAA rendering. And so you're basically getting a performance increase without too much trade-off. I thought the character looked good. These trees, though, do look worse on the right. If you look at the fine edges, we're definitely getting more breakup on the fine edges of the tree. That's a very difficult thing for an upscaler to handle. So not perfect, but certainly much better than FSR 3 was. Again, same issue where these trees, the little fine detail edges and things like that is a very difficult thing for an upscaler to handle, and it looks passable on the right, but certainly is not equal to a native rendering. Also, if you look at the Addington sign in the background there, here's another shot where you can look at the fencing in the background as well as other things, and I think it holds up pretty good on the right-hand side, even if it's not perfect. Now we're into the game's native DLSS 3.7.1 implementation, and once again, looking at the characters swinging the arms and things like that, both have little bits of ghosting and disocclusion issues. I would not say that FSR 4 looks noticeably worse, even if there are some differences here. I think both look pretty passable. Looking at the tree, there are differences in the issues, although they do both have issues. Neither is perfect. I think FSR might have a little bit more ghosting trail on the edges of things. And again, this one being difficult, I don't think either of them match a native rendering. They both have some issues. But again, I'm surprised how close the two images look. Neither one of them is perfect. I think some things are better than others on each of the two. You can judge this for yourself. Again, looking at the fence in the background, apologies that we see the boat moving by and things like that. I do think both are doing a reasonable job of reconstructing that, although both have issues when objects pass behind it. But what if you're on a 1440p display? We're looking at 1440p balanced here. This is back to FSR 3 versus FSR 4. And look at the difference in the hair. Like, look at the hair on his head, the hair on the jacket. It's very unstable with the FSR 3 image. FSR 4 is keeping things way more cohesive. I think we can see more individual, strands of hair, a lot more cohesive, way less shimmering. I think this is a massive improvement. And this is at 1440p balanced mode, which usually with FSR 3, in some games I didn't even like quality mode all that much, and balanced mode was definitely a stretch. Here with FSR 4, again, the balanced mode is looking significantly improved compared to FSR 3.1. Way more detail, way more stability. It's, again, not absolutely perfect, and we'll look at it versus native right here to kind of look at, okay, what's native on the left, FSR 4 on the right. Again, I see a little bit of those ghosty trails on the edges of the kind of the fur on the coat and things like that, so it's not absolutely perfect, but man, it's looking close. And some of the details on the coat here, I almost think we're getting maybe more individual detail, at least when it kind of stands still, occasionally on the right, which is interesting. Again, here you can occasionally, I think, see a few more individual strands of the hair and things like that. On the right when it's not in motion, although in general we do get a bit more ghosting when it is in motion. But yeah, this is holding up fairly well against a native TAA, even if it isn't visually identical. So overall, I would say this scene is a pretty good showing for FSR 4 at 1440p. What about against 3.7.1 DLSS? Well, again, neither of them is reconstructing the hair on the jacket perfectly. This is a very challenging thing for upscalers to do with all of that fine little detail overlapping and things like that, so neither is perfect, but I really think FSR 4 here is holding up extremely well in comparison to DLSS 3.7.1 in this case. Again, in motion, both of them have a little bit of breakup and ghosting. It's not absolutely perfect, but it is looking pretty good. Now, in running at 1440p balanced, again, look at the massive trailing issues behind the character's arms as they swing and as things are disoccluded. FSR 4 cleans this up extremely nicely in comparison. Looking at the tree details, again, you are losing tons of detail and it's very shimmery on the left-hand side of the screen, way more cohesive on the right side of the screen. So I think that is extremely exciting. Here again, looking at the details on the left in the tree, I think especially in motion, you see tons of breakup and shimmer. And again, it's not perfect on the right-hand side, but it is massively improved with FSR 4. And again, this is zoomed in massively. Look at the fence in the background here. FSR 3 versus FSR 4. That fence on FSR 3 is a shimmering mess. and FSR4 looks extremely stable. This is, like I said, a massive improvement over FSR3. Now, if we look at native TAA on the left versus FSR4 on the right, again, I am hard-pressed to say that this scene with the character arm swinging and things like it looks noticeably worse or anything on the right-hand side of the screen. Maybe a tiny bit more of disocclusion and ghosting around the edges, but not much. The tree, I do think, looks more stable with native TAA. I think maybe FSR4 sometimes tries to pull in a little more detail and crispness, a little sharpness to it, but definitely has some ghosting and some instability when compared with the native TAA image. So, but again, I think it's holding up fairly well. So again, this is 1440p balanced mode on the right versus a native TAA on the left. Again, a place to look is the fencing, and I actually think FSR4 is pulling in more detail on those fence lines. They do look a little bit stronger, which is, again, compared to the native TAA render. But what about versus DLSS 3.7.1? Again, apologies that I think I left RT reflections on the DLSS side, so don't look at differences in reflections. Look at things like the ghosting of the arm swinging and things like that. Look at the stability of the tree. And again, neither of them is perfect, and they have different issues. I do think DLSS does a slightly better job with that tree. I find the artifacting on FSR4 a little more distracting than what I'm seeing with DLSS. On this tree, though, in the swinging motion, I actually feel like there's less stability in the DLSS image. When the tree branches are kind of all overlapping over each other, but then when it's moving a little more smoothly, they look more similar. Again, you can look at it as the power line, power pole kind of overlaps over things. Here, unfortunately, we have a boat going in the background when we're looking at that fence, but I think the boat will move by in a second. And I think that the FSR4 image is maybe giving visual pieces of the fence. But what if we drop down to 1080p resolution? We're back to FSR3 versus FSR4. 1080p, I would basically never use FSR3. Look how unstable that is and how blurry that is. Look at the right-hand side of the screen. It's holding up massively better. To me, this now makes FSR usable at 1080p in a pinch, whereas previously, just due to the amount of flicker and fizzly instability, I just didn't like using FSR3 at 1080p if there was any other choice. Again, look at his hair in motion, how crispy and fizzly, I don't know how to describe it. It breaks up and pixelates so much on the left-hand side of the screen. On the right hand with FSR4, you do get a little bit of ghosty trails, but so much more detail and so much less of a distracting flicker, which is a massive improvement. Now we're looking at native TAA on the left versus FSR4. And FSR4 certainly has a little more instability. Not that even native TAA does a perfect job here, because we're not down to 1080p resolution. So I would say that the FSR4 image has a little more ghosting going on when you look at the little trails of the hair and things like that. But again, it's not a massive downgrade. In other words, it looks usable now. FSR looks usable at 1080p quality settings compared to native TAA, whereas it used to not. I think it also seems to be having a little more sharpening going on here, which I think some people might actually like if you look at some of the details in like the eyebrow right now in this scene. So depending on your image preferences, again, I think that you got something good going on here. Now we're looking at DLSS 3.7.1 on the left versus FSR4, again, 1080p quality settings. And again, DLSS has some of the same kind of unstable flickering on the hair and things like that we're seeing on FSR4. So neither of them perfect here. Slightly differences to the amount of ghosting and instability that we're getting. It does feel to me like FSR has a tendency to do more of a ghosty thing to try to make it hold more stability, but at the trade-off of a little bit more of a ghosting trail. Again, which kind of artifacting bothers you more? I don't know. It kind of depends on you, right? So both of them have some minor issues here, but again, both of them are fairly close to the native TAA that we saw. Here we're looking at FSR3 versus FSR4 at 1080p quality in motion, and it just speaks for itself. Look at how awful the trailing is behind the arms and head and in motion on the character on FSR 3, and FSR 4 is much more stable. Look at that tree. It is a shimmering mess on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, yeah, there's a little bit of ghosting and instability, but it is a night and day improvement. So I'm just very happy to see these types of improvements with FSR 4. This is much more usable at 1080p than it used to be. Looking at these trees, again, it is a shimmering, unstable mess on the left-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side of the screen, sure, there's a little bit of blur and ghosting, but overall fairly stable. I wouldn't call any of these issues extremely distracting. And again, remember, this is a 3x zoom on a 1080p image. It's slowed down to 50%. Here you can look at Spider-Man's head, see the same kind of ghosting, trailing stuff on FSR 3 cleaned up on FSR 4, and also look at the fence line in the background, at least when there's not a boat going by. And you can see that it's an unstable, flickering mess on the FSR 3 image, and it is fairly stable on the right with FSR 4. Also, I did want to do a little bit of DLSS that's zoomed back out. So this is DLSS 3 1080p quality versus FSR 4. And check that out. I think things are looking pretty good. I almost maybe see a little more ghosting around the head on the DLSS image. But honestly, it's pretty close. I think we're getting a very good experience. To discuss is what about performance. So this is now running at full speed, and in the previous captures, I locked everything to 60 FPS for the capture. In this testing, I'm letting everything run at full speed, so you're going to get a lot more YouTube compression artifacts, but feel free to pause and slow down and zoom in, which I have actually done. I've looked at this footage that way, but keep in mind that any screen tearing and motion judder is because we're now capturing out of sync with the gameplay numbers. But what we're looking at for now is performance testing. So here we're looking at Call of Duty Black Ops 6 at 4K basic settings with performance mode upscaling versus a native TAA. FSR 3 gains 59% performance versus a native TAA. And FSR 4 only gains 36%. So this, I would say, is the biggest negative when we're looking at FSR 4 versus FSR 3, is it is not as fast of an algorithm. So that's unfortunate. Here I'm testing God of War Ragnarok. This time we're looking at 4K quality level upscaling. FSR 3 gains 38% versus native TAA on the left, whereas FSR 4 gains 29%. So it's, again, a faster algorithm to use FSR 3, but FSR 4 is, I think, preserving more detail again here. Sorry that this type of gameplay capture is a little harder to get in perfect side-by-sides if you're trying to slow down and compare. But this section of the video is more about performance testing. I also checked out Horizon Forbidden West at 4K quality settings, where native was hitting 76 FPS, FSR 3 hit 101. That's a 33% performance boost using FSR 3.1 quality, whereas FSR 4 was at 96 FPS versus the 76 at native, which is a 26% performance boost. So again, in all scenes that I've tested here, FSR 4 gains less performance than FSR 3 does, but it is still a noticeable performance boost when compared with a native TAA image. And again, Call of Duty was looking at performance mode upscaling, and then here we're looking at quality, and God of War was also looking at quality. Now, there are a bunch of other games with FSR 4. Let me pop out for some final thoughts. Overall, I am extremely happy with FSR 4's image quality. Overall, I think it is now close enough to native that it is extremely usable in the games that I've had time to test. It is not completely identical or better than native in all situations, but in my testing, DLSS was not either. And I do think that image quality-wise, it still has some differences with DLSS, but in the side-by-sides, especially those slowdowns in Spider-Man, it looked close enough that basically, I think that from an image quality perspective, this has gone a long way to removing that, like, you know, if you don't buy NVIDIA, you're not going to get a good upscaler. Because I think with FSR 3, we saw here that that's kind of the case. It had some major issues. Again, looking at some of these side-by-sides in Spider-Man, things like that. And I think that at all resolutions, 4K, 1440p, and 1080p, we've seen a massive improvement with FSR 4. The biggest questions I still have remaining is, number one, I spent hours gathering this footage in time for the day one review, but I had to stop here. This was not a lot of games tested. So I'm really hoping and looking forward to see, I know Hardware Unboxed usually does some really detailed testing with a lot of games. Sometimes we get some from Digital Foundry. So I'll certainly be looking out for what other reviewers are getting when they look at a maybe wider variety of games and settings, and that would be awesome. But yeah, image quality was very good in the amount of testing I was able to do. And again, it's become usable at 1080p and 1440p, whereas I thought previously it wasn't. The biggest downside for me so far is performance isn't matching FSR 3. Now, keep in mind that with DLSS 4 versus DLSS 3, there was also a bit of a regression in performance. So there is that. But again, it would have been nice to have got this image quality at no degradation to performance. But again, it is noticeably better. If I pause even on things like this, again, you might need to pinch and zoom to see it, or maybe you'll get lost in YouTube compression, but little fine details like this fence line are blurring together on FSR 3, but looking absolutely crisp like native with FSR 4. So it is certainly getting you improved images. The biggest question I have now, or kind of the biggest caveat, so do we say that FSR 4 has now closed the gap with DLSS and is no longer a thing to worry about? Well, first of all, this video was focused on upscaling, not frame generation, so that's another area we should explore. Also, with frame generation in mind, there's multi-frame gen and all of that. So frame generation is its own other discussion. Also, there's game support, and I think that this is where I still have the biggest issue with FSR 4. At launch, there is a little over 30 games supported for FSR 4. Now, the way this works is if you're in a game that has support, you just hit like Alt-R if you're using default hotkeys to open up your Radeon software, and then there'll be a little driver toggle that'll pop right up to implement FSR 4. There you go. Now, you do have to do that. You can't do it during the game. The game does have to be restarted, so that's a little annoying, but it's basically just switching to the FSR 4 pathway in games that have the support. Now, there was some indication that this might work in any game that has FSR 3.1 or above, since it has the upgradable DLL. However, the games at launch list, and this is accurate according to, this article is from videocards.com. I put this so you could link to it using my sources, but AMD's reviewer guide does confirm these are the 35 game supports at launch. However, I've noticed that there are some games with FSR 3.1 support that don't initially, at least, have FSR 4 support. So it's not as simple as if it has FSR 3.1, you can just click the button in your driver, no questions asked. For example, Ghost of Tsushima was a game that I had reviewed and I benchmarked, and I was using the FSR 3, and it was FSR 3.1, and I was looking to test it against FSR 4, and I couldn't because the driver toggle there just didn't exist. And if you check this list, this is alphabetical, there is no Ghost of Tsushima on this list. Now, I get the feeling it's more of just a whitelisting thing. AMD is probably trying to do a little bit of quality control just to make sure that it works well before giving you the option of using it. I also have not explored whether or not you can just manually drop in the FSR 4 DLL file. That's not something I was exploring at this time. I have a feeling that once this is all out in the wild, modders and everybody will take a look at that and see what's possible. AMD has confirmed 75 plus games will be coming in 2025 with FSR 4 support, so there is that. But anyway, there's certain games that aren't on this list, like Cyberpunk 2077. I think a lot of people would want to use this. That has FSR 3, not 3.1, and that's really unfortunate. So anyway, I would say that where DLSS still seems to have a big advantage is in game support. Now, if it's easy to just implement FSR 3.1 and have that automatically then also get verified for FSR 4 support, I think this could be good moving forward. And the last thing I should mention is if you're hopeful about using FSR 4 on your older AMD products, this is a compatibility of the RX 9000 series graphics and above. AMD has mentioned exploring the possibility of, looking into support on the older GPUs, but the truth is, AMD's new 9000 series has way more machine learning based upscaling compute power using FP8 precision, whereas the older generations don't have that, and that seems to be what FSR 4 is based off of. So I have a feeling that if any machine learning upscaler eventually comes available for the previous generations, it probably would end up being a bit of a degraded experience, similar to how Intel's XeSS offers a less good version for non-Intel cards. So that would be my guess. And again, there's absolutely no confirmation that any ML-based upscaler is for sure coming to previous generations. This is a 9000 series exclusive. So anyway, overall, my first impressions based on the hours of testing that I could do here, and I did also just play around in games for a while and see how it felt, was that it was very usable now in situations where I thought FSR 3 would be a last resort if you'd already turned down a lot of other graphic settings and weren't getting the performance you were looking for. So I think this is overall very good, and I'll be looking out for other people's coverage on this to see a wider variety of games tested, because I'm one person and also trying to get the actual benchmarking results out. But I wanted to get something to you on day one with some good side-by-side footage and all that. I hope all of you have an excellent day.